Good afternoon to our esteemed guests, faculty members, students, and friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this very special event in honor of the late Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan, a distinguished scholar whose contributions to the field of international law have left an indelible mark. Today, we gather to honor the legacy of Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan and reflect on the vital role international legal frameworks play in addressing one of the most pressing challenges of our time, climate change. So without further ado, let us begin this program with a ceremonial floral tribute and lighting of the lamp. I would like to invite our esteemed dignitaries on stage to join us for this moment of reverence. Now, it is my privilege to invite Professor Dabiru Sridhar Patnaik, Professor and Registrar, O.P. Jindal Global University, to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to everyone. You have to excuse my coarse voice. First of all, I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Luther Rangreji, our distinguished speaker this afternoon, who is currently working as Joint Secretary and Legal Advisor, Legal and Treaties Division, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and my teachers, Professor Chimney, Professor Tyagi, esteemed colleagues, Professor Gudmundur Eriksson, the Executive Dean of the Law School, Professor Srijit, Associate Dean, Professor Kushbu, and all my faculty colleagues and dear students to this very important initiative this afternoon, called Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan Memorial Lecture on International Law and the Protection of Global Climate. Well, at the outset, I must say that words fail me to express whatever I wanted to about the role and contributions made by Professor Khan, because to start with, I have been touched by his life, both personally and professionally. I am sure many of you are aware the varied contributions made by Professor Khan to the field of international law. And if only you have surveyed his works through the early part of the early 1960s till about a decade ago, you would notice that he made seminal contributions to disparate areas of international law, be it public international law, law of international organizations, and most importantly, even some of the niche areas of those days and times, law of the sea, fisheries law, and international environmental law, amongst others. Well, time is too short for us to discuss any of these works in detail, and that would certainly require a commemorative seminar, because that's the expanse of work which Professor Khan had contributed over the period of time that he spent in the field of international law, working at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and preceding his stint at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, the School of International Studies, a very historic point over here. He was associated with the Indian School of International Studies as part of the Indian Council for World Affairs, where he was a PhD candidate working on a seminal area those days, and which really left a deep impact on the law of international organizations. And the title of the work happens to be The Implied Powers of the United Nations, which was later examined by Professor Quincy Wright and Sir Ivor Jennings of the ICJ. And interestingly, Professor Khan wrote this work under the supervision of Dr. Naginder Singh, who went on to work as the President of the International Court of Justice. So that to you is a kind of a testament to the kind of work which Professor Khan had initiated, and later on he was inducted into the School of International Studies upon the merger of the Indian School of International Studies with the School of International Studies at the JNU, and along with Professor R.P. Anand, one can very clearly say that they both have dominated the world scene on international law, which was during those days considered to be a Western hegemonic space. But what really makes Professor Khan apart, in addition to his distinguished intellectual contributions, is that he's truly an international lawyer, wherein he straddled the paths of teaching, research, advisory, and even international practice, be it his appearance as counsel for Qatar in the Qatar versus Bahrain dispute before the International Court of Justice, and even for Iran on multiple occasions before the Iran US claims tribunals. And also, he contributed to the development of the field of environmental law as an advisor to the United Nations Environment Program, to the Food and Agricultural Organization, and he worked on diverse areas. But what makes him special is that whenever you read his works or whenever you listen to Professor Khan, he always told his stories with a great felicity, which I personally learned from him because I had the good fortune of directly working with Professor Khan during my formative years. And whatever one could say in 100 lines, Professor Khan could eloquently state that in 10 lines and tell you how clear you ought to be with your concepts while you are engaging with a particular topic. And for students of the current generation, including our own generation, wherein we have been fortunate enough to have access to internet resources and other open access resources, those were not the days when those resources were even available. But if you look at the wide variety of work that Professor Khan did in the field of organizations, to environmental law, to fisheries, to other areas of law, not to forget even the field of international trade law and economic law, that's really so very impressive. And on many occasions, he shared his experiences with me and even my other colleagues. Well, I'm a small fish in this room. The initial beneficiaries of his supervision, teaching, and guidance happens to be Professor Chimney, who is present amongst us, and of course, Professor Tyagi as well, who would be joining us. I came much later, but in between we also have Dr. Luther Rangreji, who had the opportunity of working with him on multiple projects during his days at JNU. And in a way, these projects on the field of environmental law even later inspired Dr. Luther to take up environmental law as one of his core areas of work. So in addition to, the way in which Professor Khan used to handle his works and lectures with such great felicity, he also never restricted himself traditionally to the field of international law, and had been so creative for his period and for his times. For example, many a times we do talk about, when we refer to Professor Khan, a work or here or there pertaining to the implied powers of the United Nations or Kashmir and United Nations, or the work of ITLOS, one of the last works which he co-edited with Dr. P.C. Rao, a former law secretary and member of the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. But in between, there is one particular work which people seldom talk about, and that happens to be his singular contribution to the field of comparative law. Way back in the early 1970s, when Professor Khan was associated as an associate research professor with the Indian Law Institute, there was a time a great churning was going on, and in other jurisdictions, comparative law was a rage, and universities both in Europe and the United States, they do have a special focus on comparative law, unlike in our country where we still do not have that strong tradition of comparative law, unfortunately. And that was the time when Professor Khan commissioned a work on the study and methods of comparative law in consultation with Professor C.J. Hamison of Cambridge University. You will be very astonished and pleasantly surprised to know that's the only work available in India thus far on methods of comparative law, and there is only one copy available with the Indian Society of International Law. But if any one of you would be interested, I would certainly request and recommend that you should place and lay your hands on that book to understand the purpose of legal education and to understand the importance of areas like comparative law and their relationship with international law, and that makes you a very good sort of a legal professional and a very good student of law as well. The other important aspect that I would like to touch upon when we talk about Professor Khan, and it's a great honor that we are having this lecture today. Many a times we keep hearing from students and faculty members alike whenever they embark on conducting research on a particular area, that either there are lack of enough resources, materials, particularly secondary resources, and they seldom even consider primary resources. But one example I must give you, if you go back and lay your hands on a particular journal called the Heidelberg Journal of International Law, published by the Max Planck Institute for International and Public Law, Professor Khan published a piece way back in 2000s, I think 2000 or 2001, on anti-globalization protests. It's a case study for me personally on the method in which he developed that particular article, because if you go through even the footnotes, you will not find any article from a journal or from an edited volume, from a monograph, but you will only find references to the New York Times or the International Herald Tribune. That only goes on to show how perceptive an observer Professor Khan was, and that's the lesson that each one of us should even learn and emulate if you want to be good law students and law teachers and of course scholars, because being a good observer is very important for us to understand the concept and even the subject. And he dabbled that particular work with international law in the background being the conceptual framework for him, and to understand the effects of globalization on international law while dealing with that particular article. So likewise, even Professor Khan made many other contributions, like today standing at the OP Jindal Global University in the middle of this hall, we all proudly claim the nature and purpose and importance of offering interdisciplinary education. But those were the days way back in 60s and 70s when Professor Khan envisioned the need for offering an interdisciplinary legal education, bringing in not only a cadre of lawyers per se, but even specialists from other social sciences and humanities. And he advocated for something called the National School of Law, not to mistake that with the National Law School of India or any of the other national law universities, but he proclaimed about a merger of disciplines in order to have quote unquote well-nourished lawyers who can understand quote unquote the felt needs of the society. Likewise, he played an instrumental role even in the establishment of the Center for International Legal Studies at the JNU, along with Professor R.P. Anand, and of course later contributed in a very significant way by other esteemed teachers, Professor V.S. Mani, Professor Chimney, and Professor Tyagi. And that was a time when even the action shifted from the Madras School of Thought, that's the University of Madras Department of Legal Studies, under the legendary leadership of Professor C.H. Alexandrovis, to Delhi, wherein all of them and even others, people like Professor M.K. Nawaz and Dr. K. Krishna Rao, played a major role in setting up the center and the School of Thought here, located both within the spaces of the Indian Society of International Law and of course JNU. And today it gives us a greater joy when we see that even places like the Jindal Global Law School of the OP Jindal Global University, we do have an active Center for International Legal Studies governed by Professor Gudmundur Eriksson and other colleagues from the center contributing to this particular endeavor. But I think this is only the beginning, because we need more such initiatives, and activities like the one that we are having this afternoon is only to get more inspired to make greater contributions. And here we are so fortunate that today we could organize this lecture, courtesy the consent even given by the immediate family members of Professor Khan. His son was supposed to join us this morning, but due to some other unavoidable commitments, he could not join us. In a way, even we have been fortunate that years ago, if I vividly recall, about a decade ago, when we planned and we conducted a faculty development workshop for the faculty members of the Jindal Global Law School, Professor Khan personally was here to engage with our faculty members. And that day and moment was so special because that occasion was even graced by Professor V.S. Mani, in whose memory we organized a lecture recently on space law, and today we are here garnering an opportunity from this particular event to know more about him and his works by having a lecture on international law and the protection of the global climate, which will be delivered by Dr. Luther, who is aptly suitable. Again, he is someone who embodies the values enshrined by Dr. Khan, and even Dr. Luther straddles the path of teaching, research, and advisory, having worked with organizations like the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, and then later the South Asian University, and of course his long-standing association with the Ministry of External Affairs, and even having participated in so many intergovernmental negotiations in the field of environmental law. And Dr. Luther is not new to us. He has been associated with our activities for quite some time, both here and in Delhi, wherein we have a joint program with the WWF on the theme LLM in environmental law, energy, and climate change. And Dr. Luther has been contributing there as well. But today, this is one such opportunity wherein he's going to deliver a lecture on the said topic and share his reflections on the topic, which I'm sure each one of us will get benefited. And even it's a moment to again recall the worthy contributions made by Professor Khan. So on this particular note, I welcome each one of you, and I also bring in greetings from the Vice Chancellor for this auspicious program this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for your inspiring words. Now I would like to invite Dr. Khushbu Chauhan, Associate Professor and Associate Dean JGLS, to deliver the introductory address.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is both an honor and a privilege to welcome you all to the inaugural Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan Memorial Lecture. This lecture serves not only as a tribute to the outstanding contributions of Professor Khan to the field of international law, but also as a platform to engage with one of the most pressing global legal issues of our times. Professor Khan was a towering figure in international legal scholarship, known for his dedication to advancing the principles of justice and his lifelong commitment to nurturing young minds in the field. Today, we gather to continue with his legacy of intellectual engagement with an issue of paramount importance: international law and the protection of global climate. The increasing urgency of climate change has placed unprecedented demands on the global legal order, pushing states, international organizations, and civil society to develop more robust legal frameworks for environmental protection and sustainability. To guide us through this vital discussion, we are honored to have with us Dr. Luther Rangreji, a distinguished practitioner and scholar of international law, and someone who has not only served with distinction in various roles within the Ministry of External Affairs of India, but has also contributed to the country's legal positions on international environmental issues. His wealth of experience and insightful perspectives make him the perfect speaker for today's lecture. Dr. Luther will delve into the evolving role of international law in addressing one of the most critical challenges of our times. He will examine the legal frameworks, multilateral agreements, and ongoing international negotiations aimed at combating climate change, as well as the responsibilities of states and other global actors. As we listen to his remarks today, let us reflect on international law's role in ensuring a sustainable future for all. We hope this lecture will inspire further discourse on how we, as legal scholars and practitioners, can contribute to this urgent global endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chauhan, for your insightful remarks. To further honor the life of Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan, may I now invite Professor Dr. S.G. Srijit, Professor and Executive Dean JGLS and Dean Strategy and Institution Building, O.P. Jindal Global University, to share his reflections on the life and works of Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan. Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Registrar has already done my job. There's nothing much left for me to say. But for me, this is a remarkable reunion to pay tribute to the Doyen of International Law in India, Professor Dr. Rehmatullah Khan, in the presence of my beloved teacher, Professor B.S. Chimney, with my classmate, Professor Sridhar Patnaik, and with a junior, Professor Soumya Rajaram. So this is basically a JNU Center for International Legal Studies reunion for us. As I said, Registrar has already done my job, so apologies if there are any minor overlaps, but each one is a voice, so probably this may sound different. Professor Rehmatullah Khan is a professor of international law. Well, that's the most basic thing one could say about him. But Professor Rehmatullah Khan was also a voice. What type of a voice he was? He was a voice of the Anand tradition, the tradition which Professor Patnaik mentioned, the tradition of Professor R.P. Anand, which tried to develop an Indian approach to international law way back in the 1960s. When we came out from the shackles of colonialism with a big colonial hangover, he tried to give an indigenous touch to Indian international law. Professor Rehmatullah Khan belongs to that tradition. He had a faith in the constitutive and transformative power of international law. He believed that international law is an evolutionary paradigm, and India has a major role to play in that paradigm. He chose a very interesting area to subject his analysis to international organizations or international institutions, because he considered international institutions as the sites where international decisions are made. So in order to understand how global events are shaped, how global discursivity evolves, you need to revisit how decisions are made. Hence, he chose these sites of international decision-making for a thorough scrutiny. So in that sense, I may say Professor Rehmatullah Khan was a professor of international organizations law, or a professor of international organizations. And I'm saying that because he was a professor of international organizations even before international organizations became an area study in public international law, or even if it could claim any specialized branch status in international law. Today, we have many scholars on that landscape: Professor N.D. White, Professor D.W. Bovett, Professor Jan Klabers, Professor Jose Alvarez, all produced magnum opuses on international organizations. But Professor Khan always stood on the other side of the spectrum. He was always critical about the functions of international institutions. So in that sense, I may say he was a professor of critical international organization studies, if I may take the privilege to coin the words like that, pretty much like critical legal studies or critical constitution studies. He introduced criticism into the law of international organizations. If I may look at some of the earliest writings of Professor Khan, he published his first article in the year 1964 when he was 29 years old, in Foreign Affairs Bulletin. And then in the subsequent year, he produced a great piece in Journal of the Indian Law Institute with the title, Development of the Juridical Status of International Organizations. He mainly subjected the membership's case of the United Nations, which came before the ICJ for an analysis. Well, you know, the picture was very gloomy, because anybody who embarked on the study of international organizations, what awaited them was the tale of a failure, the tale of the leak. So much gloom prevailed there. There was no hope at all. There was only tales about the failure of the peace, reinforcing that historical tragedy that war continues to be the only way for even the post-colonial world to socialize. But UN was a ray of hope in the horizon. With decolonization, with the United Nations, as I said, hopes began to rise. But the pall of gloom still prevailed in the horizon. So Professor Khan embarked upon the study of international organizations, particularly United Nations, at that point in time. There was a lot of claims in the horizon at that point that the UN, with its means and materials, was probably a positivistic faith in international law. Many began to point out that, look, finally international law too has become a law. United Nations is literally a global parliament, a global legislature with a global judiciary. But we all know that they were very far from being positivistic traditions, and Professor Khan candidly in his piece wrote that, well, UN is still far from being a positivistic institution, because in the end, in every international organization, the sovereign will prevails. UN is nothing but a construct of the states. International law is what the states make of it. So this was Professor Khan's conclusion in that article. And 5 years later, of course, he continued to write, but 5 years later, in 1917, he wrote that book which Registrar alluded to, The Implied Powers of the United Nations. Well, in this book, he believed that implied powers exist. But that does not make United Nations or international organizations with an overpowering, like an overpowering sway over the states. So that doesn't give international organizations an overpowering sway over the states. He believed that states would continue to remain sovereign. Nothing can fly over sovereignty. And he wanted the international organizations to be under constant checks. periodic reviews so that they don't become, if I may borrow this terminology from Professor Andrew Guzman's article, Frankensteins. Is this not this check which Professor Khan suggested, which Professor Andrew Guzman emphasized in his work with the title Dr. Frankenstein's International Organizations, he published in European Journal of International Law. So here, Dr. Guzman mentioned that international organizations, as we think, they're not like hard law monsters, but they're just like soft law beings, which are pretty much the creations of the state. International organizations don't legislate. They don't legislate. Rather, states use international organizations to create norms to which they will commit themselves to. This was the conclusion of Andrew Guzman, a conclusion which very well matches with Professor Khan's conclusion in the book Implied Powers of International Law. And later on, a renowned scholar, a contemporary scholar of international law, Professor Jan Klabbers, would argue that international organizations today do only two functions. One is a managerial function. Second, they have a coordination function. They are not larger than life, a conclusion which Professor Khan made in 1970s. Then in 1969, almost the same time, again, Registrar alluded to this piece, he wrote on Kashmir and international law. Well, again, this was not really a study on the political Kashmir or about Kashmir's claim for self-determination, but rather, this was an article where he said that caught between the language of Chapter 4 and Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, the Kashmir issue remained unresolved, and he attributed that failure to United Nations. So again, his criticism continued that UN abjectly failed in settling the Kashmir dispute because too much of verbosity of Article 6, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the Charter of United Nations. But you could see that there was a poncho for Professor Khan he had a poncho for international organizations law and towards international institutions. But that does not make him epistemically fixated. He definitely transcended that. He was aware of the global events. And in 1992, Professor Khan wrote a piece on environment versus development. Environment versus development. This was right after the Rio Declaration, and he published that in a journal which he himself founded and edited, Asian Yearbook of International Law. And in this case, he, through the eyes of the Tehri Dam case, you all might know at that point, the Tehri Bandh Sankarsh Samiti has been formed, and the Supreme Court of India delivered the decision that Tehri Dam should stay. Development matters for us. Dams are temples of modernity, and we shall have dams no matter what happens to the environment. Somewhat neutral discourse. And Professor Khan went on to argue in this article, Environment versus Development, that this is a classic case of the ambivalence on a matter like environment versus development. Especially dam cases have an ambivalence to that, and Supreme Court experienced this ambivalence. But he concluded by investing a lot of faith in sustainable development. Professor Khan believed that this essential balance between between environment and development could be struck. He continued to write on dams. He later on wrote on Narmada Dam, and he believed that dams are the classic examples to highlight environment versus development debates. I agree to this problematization to a large extent because Indian Supreme Court at some point espoused the national vision given by Prime Minister Nehru that dams are temples of modernity and it's our responsibility to uphold this value. Something I would later on problematize in my piece, DAM, Jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of India in Hastings International and Comparative Law Review. I was very inspired by Professor Khan's analytic on the dams. Then, Registrar alluded to this piece as well, and that was a very good information that he wrote on legal education. And he published a piece in Journal of Indian Law Institute with the title, National School of Law, a Proposal. Now, what did he mean by a National School of Law? And this was in 1972. Even the first National Law School, the dinosaur, was about to be born. Professor Menon probably might not have even thought about introducing 5-year law programs or national law schools. In 1972, he wrote this piece, and he wanted this school to be research-oriented school. Maybe a JNU model school, probably that was in his mind. And he wanted to move away from case law-based approach, which was quite predominant at that point in Delhi University, Campus Law Center. He considered that as very exegetical way of teaching, and he believed that we should break all this exegetical, hermeneutic way of teaching, which only provides us with internal perspectives of law. he believed that external perspectives equally matter, and he suggested that we need to explore this through socio-legal studies, something which we are committed through our BA Legal Studies program. So he said that law is not all about judicial imaginations. Law is also about how they play out in actual social context. And he said he believed that that could only be done by interdisciplinary studies, something later on Professor Menon would actualize through the 5-year law program with your cocktail of liberal disciplines in the first 2 years. Registrar mentioned this. He believed in the power of the comparative. He believed in the power of the transnational. And this term, if we may use in the modern context, is an essential constituent of what Professor Raj waxes eloquent, global. And Professor Menon later on in 2007, he also emphasized the same, that the key to globalization, the key to global legal education is teaching of comparative law. Professor Raj subsequently emphasized this in his work in Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies, that this comparative is in fact what manifests as global legal education. He also suggested for chairs dedicated to disciplines in order to foster conversations, in order to foster research on certain areas. And finally, he concludes this article by saying that in India, so far, I find only 2 sites for this kind of a remarkable experiment called the National School of Law. One, of course, his own institution, Jawaharlal Nehru University, maybe Center for International Legal Studies, and second, Indian Law Institute. And much later, in 1984, Professor Menon would found the National Law School of India University. Registrar mentioned this article also. That's what I said. He has literally vacuumed everything. Anti-globalization protest. This is the last article, listed article, which Professor Khan wrote in Heidelberg Journal of International Law. I would like to talk a little bit about this. Look at the title, Anti-Globalization Protest. This was the year 2001, and I think after that he retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He uses one expression, which is what I like most about this. He said that the social movements, especially protests, they have a risk. They can be either sublime or they can be ridiculous. And the distance between the sublime and the ridiculous is just a step. So if you don't run a social movement properly, you run the risk of being ridiculous. Otherwise, your social movement would be nothing but a participation in the decision-making from the outside. It would be what we call sublime. And this sublimity of the social movements, later on, Professor Balakrishnan Rajagopal, in his book, International Law from Below, established social movements as yet another way to socialize in international relations. Professor Chimney made a beautiful argument that if social movements should actualize their true potentials, there should be a merger of the leftist parties with trade union movements to join hands. But of course, he suggested that ultimately this should be based on the Gandhian ideals, non-violent models. This was nothing but what Professor Philip Allott alluded to, that revolutions should be in the minds, not in the streets. But Professor Khan, too, in the same vein as Professor Chimney, at that point argued that the Western NGOs should be viewed skeptically because they are agents of a transnational capitalist class. And he considered NGOs also as neoliberal agents. If they are international organizations, if NGOs are international organizations, then Professor Khan was nothing but alluding to a new politics of globalization. And this was one lecture Professor Khan gave to my batch, the role of NGOs in globalization, and he was skeptical throughout about the role of Western NGOs. He considered them as agents of transnational capitalistic class. Before I conclude, let me speak a little bit about the language, the style of writing of Professor Khan. He used what we call plain language, but not lackluster. He used plain language. Now, you know that in linguistics, there was this movement called the plain English movement. I don't know whether Professor Khan was really inspired by the plain English movement or not, but at least he asked this question to himself: can law be spoken without lawyers? Or can law be spoken without using the style of the lawyers? He demystified the notion that law can only be spoken in the lawyerly language. So intelligible was his style of writing. But then, again, there is a question. Does that intelligibility come at the cost of obscuring the essential complexities of law? The complexities which we cherish in our law schools. Many times the complexity we talk about could be the microatom to a big doctrine. Did it come at the cost of obscuring these complex legalities or not? I'll just read out a small passage from Professor Khan. You please judge it yourself. This sounds a startling proposition, but it is not. The British Parliament, in theory, can legislate on matters ranging from granting independence to its colonial possessions, to prohibiting the docking of dogs' tails in order to facilitate their efficient wagging. It could even decree that all blue-eyed babies born on a particular day would be killed, but it does not. The British Constitution relies on good sense of the people and the members chosen to represent them in the parliament. No international organization, not even the United Nations, has such a sweeping powers as British Parliament. I leave it to you to judge whether his intelligibility comes at the cost of masking, hiding the essential complexities of legal discourse or not. And Professor Khan has made himself available to this scrutiny for us. Lastly, a few words on the legacy, and I'm concluding here. So Professor Khan has been instrumental in founding the Asian Yearbook of International Law, which still continues to influence the academic community. Of course, today there are many other journals in the academic landscape. We have Asian Journal of International Law, which is the new avatar of the Singapore Yearbook of International and Comparative Law. We have Journal of East Asia and International Law, Chinese Journal of International Law, but Asian Yearbook of International Law still continues to be published. Now, Brill has taken over it. He was its founding editor, and he continued to be the editor from 1991 to 2006. This group of scholars who founded the Asian Yearbook of International Law also ventured into a project, Manual of Asian International Law, but this still remains as an unfulfilled dream. By the time Professor Khan had taken active retirement from academia, well, rather, he cocooned himself more for self-ruminations, but because of which this project, the Manual of Asian International Law, remains an unfulfilled project. I'm sure that this is a legacy which should be taken forward. Professor Tyagi, one of his students in JNU, continues to carry this legacy forward by teaching his course on international organizations and also by writing his mammoth treatise on United Nations Human Rights Commission. And Professor Chimney continues to critique the role of international organizations in a neoliberal world. Of course, he has subjected their he has deemed these international organizations as agents of a new imperialism, both financial and technological. Yet another student of Professor Khan and our teacher, registrars and my teacher, and Professor Soumya's too, Professor Desai, has come out with a blog on reflections on the law of international organizations, a tribute of a student to Professor Rehmatullah Khan, of course, which has beautifully captured the oeuvre of Professor Rehmatullah Khan. And finally, 2 years back, Professor Desai has established a wall of honors in the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, where that's a wall of honor where to pay tribute to all the legendary teachers who taught in the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Khan's picture still adorns it. And I'm very proud to say that alongside Professor Khan's picture, pictures of Professor Chimney and Professor Tyagi also adorn that wall. That's the legacy of Professor Rehmatullah Khan, and I'm sure that some of you might, after hearing me and Registrar, be inspired to follow the lives and works of Professor Rehmatullah Khan. Thank you very much.